Hello, hello, and welcome to Inner Work for Greater Good. My name is Emily Eldridge. As always, I'm here to teach you inner work that accelerates your power to change the world, to make a difference, to be the brightest, most incredible presence you can possibly be, which is, I hope, something that you want, because when you shine your light, or I should say, the brighter you shine, the brighter you light up our world. And the world needs our light. Sorry, I'm doing a little adjusting here. As you can see, I'm in a different background. I'm actually at my parents' house, and trying to get as much light as I possibly can. In any case, today, well, speaking of which, actually, it's sort of the topic, not that my parents are quite the topic of today, but this idea of family, internalized family patterns, how family impacts us. And family can mean not just blood relatives, it can be whoever you grew up with or grew up around, who you consider to be family. From that perspective, your caregivers, the people who really formed you from an early age. So this is obviously a really huge topic. I can't necessarily, cover all the bases in just 15, 20 minutes here, but I'm just going to try. My intention is to really help you start to recognize how you may be behaving, thinking, feeling in ways that are really influenced by your family and maybe not so helpful, maybe not so useful to you, maybe even kind of toxic, and how to start to recognize those and how to undo some of those within yourself. But just to get that ball rolling, because our families and our caregivers really, really do impact a lot more than we realize. And the more I've done healing work on myself, the more I've discovered, wow, there's some really deep subconscious stuff here that I had no idea I was doing that, or I had no idea even where that came from. And the reason why this is a topic right now is because, yes, I'm with my parents right now, but also I've been spending some time with family this last week. And spending time with family definitely gives me an opportunity to come observe, some of the patterns, the dynamics, the behaviors, the attitudes, the emotional set points, whatever, the reactions or reactivity, in my family of origin, and also even in this case, my extended family. It wasn't just family of origin. And so it's always fascinating to me when I suddenly recognize that's why I react that way, or that's why I think that way, or that's why I, respond that way in those situations. When I see it in other people, when I see that, certain patterns of behavior that I internalize, whether I realize it or not. And we all do this. And one of the reasons, even from a brain perspective, and I'm not a brain expert, but one of the very basic reasons is what are called mirror neurons. So basically, my understanding is that these are the neurons inside of our brains that cause us to literally mirror what we see. And mirror neurons, from where I sit, are really, really important because, a lot of what we learn, especially as children, is based on what we see. So it's not, parents, often want to say, well, do as I say, not as I do. Yeah, well, those mirror neurons are like, no, I'm going to do as you do. That's what mirror neurons do. And so that's how we take on certain behaviors so deeply unconsciously, because those mirror neurons are just reflecting, they've just caused us to literally mirror behaviors that we've seen. And so people often say things like, God, I don't want to grow up and be like my mother or like my father. Well, sometimes that's just what happens because of those mirror neurons, but it doesn't mean you're doomed to always behave that way, or that those mirror neurons can't be sort of, I guess, undone, or sort of, not be in control. We can actually undo some of that stuff. So, but the point is that that's why we often do mirror what we see. We do as other people do, and not just as they say. And it's okay. It's about having compassion for yourself when you realize that you've just been repeating a pattern or a kind of behavior, even, belief that you saw exhibited in childhood and may still be seeing exhibited in your family. So the point is that it's about really more than anything. I just want to establish that the most important thing right now is to have compassion for yourself and for the people around you as we talk about this, because it's very easy to want to judge ourselves. Oh, damn it, why did I turn out like that? And well, mirror neurons and a lot of other reasons, because of survival, because you had to adapt. And the same thing with members of your family. I know that some of us have really, really toxic family members, but also understand that a lot of times their behaviors come out of in reaction to their environment. And so there are certain things that we may look at them and go, God, that is really not a cool behavior. Or why the hell do they do that? Well, there's some reason, that you and I may not even be aware of, some subconscious reason why they behave that way. And it could be because they learned it from their environment. It could be an adaptation. It could be a reaction against however they grew up or whatever their parents did. There can be all kinds of reasons. So it really is about having compassion. I'll just give you a few examples of what I mean when it's about, observing with my family and then recognizing it within myself. So my husband and I have these regular Sunday relationship meetings. We actually haven't had one for a few weeks, but it's for a good reason, because we realize we haven't needed one. We haven't had any we've healed so many things that we haven't had any kind of persistent issues that we needed to address on those Sunday meetings. So we actually haven't needed to meet. We'd sit down on Sundays and be like, "Not pretty good. Everything's good. Okay." But it was interesting because there was one meeting a couple of months ago, where my husband had an issue with how I behaved, how I was really reactive in a certain way. And it really bothered him, and he said, I don't like it when you react that way. Like, it hurts my feelings, or it feels like it's an overreaction. And as he was laying it out for me, he said, and I think it comes from, and he mentioned a couple members of my family. And when he said that, I was like, no, it doesn't come from that. But then I was like, wait a minute, I was like, hold on a minute. Let me just be open and receptive. And maybe he's got a point. I don't know. So as I sat with it, because that's part of our process, we sort of tell each other, here are my grievances. And then we sit with whatever the person says. And as I sat with it, I was like, wait a minute, he's right. Oh my God. That behavior that, first of all, I didn't even realize I was doing, that then he says bothers him. And that I realized, okay, I was doing that behavior. And then he says, well, he thinks it actually comes from these two members of my family and that I learned it from them. And I was like, no way. And I was like, wait a minute, he's right. He had a good point. He was able to see and observe things and behaviors in them that then he was seeing in me, or rather, I think he probably was seeing it in me and then realizing he'd seen it in them as well. And so it helped me to recognize where I'd gotten those behaviors from. And as I'm explaining this, let me just point out that this is a really good way to do step one. I'll describe it. Sort of my approach is like, first of all, you've got to be able to see what's going on. And oftentimes relationships, whether it's a romantic, like in my case with my husband, a romantic relationship, or maybe it's you have a child who's been saying, Mom, or Dad, I don't really like the way you do this. And to sit back and, it can be other people that help us recognize some of the things that we learned that we didn't even realize we were doing. So in this case, my husband was completely right. He absolutely nailed it. I was like, oh, okay, he's right. Okay, then, and I had to process that and heal that. Another example of this is that, part of my conversations this past week with some family members is that one of them was talking about, their struggles with another family member. And it was interesting because then I was able later on to observe that dynamic. And it was like, oh, I see it now. Whereas I might have just kind of like, well, whatever, that's the way things are with them. One person was really upset with how they were being treated. And then I was able to observe it myself. And I thought, oh, wow, that's pretty intense. And so as I talked to this person who was struggling, we talked about that person's history. And we talked about, when they first remember feeling that way, or if in their childhood they've been treated that way by someone. And sure enough, this person said, what I realized is that I don't remember, is that person did remember being treated that way, but also remembered treating other people that way. And so it was this interesting where they were suddenly aware of, oh, okay, this pattern here and this pattern here. And oh, and this is why I allow myself to be treated this way. And so we were able to get down there. So the point is there can be multiple layers as to why we behave the way we do. It could be also that we are, that people are treating us the way we've treated others. There can be all kinds of layers there. But the point is that she had really noticed that this other person's behavior was really upsetting for her. And that she wanted to kind of understand what those dynamics were. And also, I want to even point out, too, that it might not be just like a simple behavior here and there, like, oh, the way the father treats his son, or the way the husband treats the wife, or or partnership, wife treats the wife, whatever. But it can be more of a systemic thing that you observe within your family, and that there are certain patterns of behavior, but also like patterns of relationship, and even patterns around, for example, emotions. And the reason why I'm going to mention this is because for a lot of reasons. So when I say this, I don't mean it critically, but in part of my family, there's kind of a culture of emotional dismissiveness, like dismissing emotions. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like they don't show emotions, because they do, and it's not as though they don't, don't say I love you or whatever. But there are certain areas and certain sort of just sort of maybe it's areas of conversation, or maybe it's just certain I don't even know how the word to use, but that being emotionally dismissive is just kind of the default reaction. And just a little window into, look, I'm 48. My grandparents have all died, but they came from a generation where, like, they went through World War II, and one of them was even over there, and another one was involved in the effort, and so they come from certain generation where, and sort of the British way of putting it is like, we'll stiff upper lip. And my family isn't actually British. I mean, culturally, I guess way back we're British, but that kind of, that's what I mean by emotional dismissiveness. There's a stiff upper lip attitude, or there's that always just sort of laugh away things that upset us, rather than really dealing with the emotions. But then what can often happen is then those emotions end up oozing out somewhere else, and they show up in other kinds of behaviors that aren't healthy. And so I'm not trying to put my own family on the spot here, or members of my family, but I'm just saying that that's what can happen, is that you actually have within the family culture, within that family system, there can be sort of pervasive, in this case, attitudes about emotions or reactions to or against emotions. And so that's something else to be aware of in your own family system, and your own parents, and your own, or even in your own immediate family, of like maybe that you're repeating, is that there can be some things that are more systemic. So it can be individual behaviors and certain types of reactivity, let's say, but it can also be more systemic things. And while those systemic behaviors are sort of cultural family culture aspects, could have served the family at a particular time, if it's being carried forward and it doesn't serve the family anymore, then it might be worth looking at and releasing. And that's not to say that all family cultural things are bad. Some of them are great. My family is like fabulous. Like, they're so great in so many ways. But like all families, we've got stuff, and we've got stuff to work on that, maybe not all of us are aware of. So those, I'm trying to plant some seeds and get you thinking about the influences in your life, and how you might also be carrying those influences forward. So, unhealthy ones, unhelpful ones. So I wrote down, 3 sort of steps. This is how I tend to approach it. Is first of all, is try to notice the family pattern, and whether it's sort of just individual behaviors, or if it's something more systemic and cultural. Notice the pattern. And the reason why I mentioned my husband and I before that is because it took my husband pointing out what the patterns were, like what those reactive behaviors were, because I grew up in it. I can't necessarily see it clearly for myself. And so that's where the relationships in our lives, whether they be our own children or our partners or whatever, can actually be very helpful in recognizing things that we may not recognize ourselves. So it's important to listen to them, assuming they're reliable, witnesses for us, is listen to them and listen to maybe their criticism about, or critiques. I don't like to say criticism so much, as listen for the critique, listen for the feedback the helpful feedback that they might actually be giving you. And that's a way to really be more aware of the subconscious patterns that you're repeating, that you don't even realize you're repeating. So that's the first one. The second one is notice if you're reacting like or against. Okay, so if you're reacting or behaving like, let's say, your mother. I mean, there are plenty of ways that I behave like my mother, because my mother is a big influence in my life, and because she raised me, and because genetically I got her genes, so I got some of that. There are also a lot of ways that I'm like my dad, though, too. That's been what's interesting, is I'm noticing like, oh, I can see I get this from mom, but I'm actually more like my dad in this way. And so notice though, if, for example, if you had, let's say you had a parent who like raged at you. And so you might have taken on some of those behaviors and you end up raging at your children or other people in your life. But at the same time, or on the other hand, you might actually have ended up reacting against that. So if you saw a lot of rage in your environment and rage scares you, and you don't want to end up like that, you might be reacting against and not feel rage or deny your own anger or, suppress it or, avoid, people always talk about, I tend to avoid confrontation. I don't like confrontation, and so you might be the type who's like, well, I don't want to make that person mad. Or I don't want to upset anyone. And so you avoid it in that way. And so that's important to recognize too. Yeah, okay, you may not have turned out like your mom, but the way you've turned out may be actually a reaction against your mom. And in that case, it might still not be totally helpful because you're not in control. Your behaviors are more about reacting against something and not wanting to be that way or wanting to be perceived that way, which can have its own problems. Okay, so it's about really being in balance within. And then finally, as you notice the parts of you, well, this is number 3, there's probably a 4th one. As you notice the parts of you that formed in reaction or like, or to be like, and, to adapt in terms of your family system and your family culture. And the reason why I say notice the parts of you is because you behave that way because parts of you carry those behaviors or carry those emotional patterns or those wounds or what have you, those defense mechanisms. And when we can see it as parts, and if you've seen my other episodes, I talk a lot about this. This is basically what my work is. It's a kind of really powerful parts work, is that when we can actually see it as, oh, it's not me, it's a part of me that reacts this way. It's a part of me that's carrying the energy from that relationship, reacting like that person or against that person. And so when you can recognize the parts of you that are carrying those emotional charges or those emotional patterns or behavior patterns, and you notice those parts of you that are carrying those, it makes those behaviors and those attitudes, et cetera, a lot easier to work with, as opposed to just going, oh, I'm this way or I react this way. It's like, no, wait a minute, there's a part of me that's reacting this way. And in that case, you can do number 4, which is, I often tell people, draw it out, take my free course and learn how to draw out those parts. Because when you actually draw them out, you don't actually make them stronger within you. You actually make them less strong. You help them release their energy and externalize that energy out of you in somewhere safe onto a piece of paper, so that rather than controlling you, they're not controlling you this much. That energy is kind of released. And there's a lot more I talk about in the course where, to teach you how to really release this stuff and understand it. All right. So as always, I really hope this has been helpful to start to recognize where some of your stuff has come from, because it's come from somewhere. I mean, sure, some of it's genetics. There are plenty of ways that I think, or how I sort of, the rhythm that I follow that I think are kind of genetically, for example, like my dad or like my mom. But there's a lot of other that's, instead of nature, it's more about nurture. And when we can really undo and release some of the nurture stuff that's not helping us anymore, then we can really shine brighter in our actual nature and our truth. All right. I hope this has been helpful as always. As always, I'm Emily Eldridge with Change Light at changelight.world. Please do take the free course, take the free, get in the free community and listen to the free podcast, Dark Light Truth, which is out now. Look it up on any podcast app you've got, Dark Light Truth. And if you need to, do my last name as well so that you can find it, or look up Change Light so you can find it that way, because I've got some amazing episodes out and I've got even more amazing ones coming out. All right, take care, and I hope you're well, and I will see you next week.